Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tyagi Patirana. I'm currently a regional researcher at Amnesty International South Asia office based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. My background obviously is in human rights. I've worked a lot on transitional justice, disappearances, memorialization, counterterrorism law, that sort of thing in Sri Lanka. And today I'm here to talk with you about refugees and IDPs. And I thank the IYAP for this opportunity to speak about this. So let me start by saying that there are actually, I would say, three kinds of displaced people. And so they're not just refugees and IDPs, there's also asylum seekers. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what the difference is between a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, and who's an IDP. So a refugee is someone who's fled their country of origin and is unable or unwilling to go back because there's a well-founded fear that they will be persecuted once they return. And their persecution could be because of something like their religious belief, their ethnicity, their political belief. So there are so many kinds of ways that a group or community can be persecuted. So an asylum seeker, as opposed to a refugee, is someone who's seeking international assistance and basically refuge temporarily. So they can end up being refugees if they choose to apply for refugee status. So that doesn't mean that all asylum seekers are refugees, but all refugees have at some point become asylum seekers. IDPs, it kind of also sort of speaks for itself. That it stands for internally displaced persons, and those people could be displaced because of a number of reasons. It could be because of war, internal armed conflict, climate-related issues, natural disasters, etc. Refugees and asylum seekers, maybe IDP Sri Lanka has some kind of idea of and has an experience of, but refugees and asylum seekers a little bit less so. So I might just take this opportunity to take you through the legal framework, the international legal framework that kind of has obligations and for states. So in 1951, there's a refugee convention that was adopted, and that's the most key legal instrument when it comes to the law around refugees. And the 1951 convention, and there's a 1967 optional protocol as well. There are obviously, for state parties who sign up to it, it has legally binding consequences. Even though there is no monitoring body or a mechanism that's there to make sure that states implement the obligations of the convention. So even though there are a lot of countries who haven't signed up to the convention, for example, Sri Lanka isn't a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, so technically there's no obligation, legally binding obligation on Sri Lanka to host refugees or asylum seekers. So it's countries that have actually signed up to this convention that can and has a legal obligation to provide protection for and basically take care of any asylum seekers that come to their territory. But there is a debate on whether the principle, the international legal principle called non-refoulement, if that is jurisprudence, or we call it almost contemporary international law, where it's kind of accepted that you can't return somebody to their own origin country if they are at the risk of being persecuted in that country. So that's kind of the legal framework. So it's the 1951 Refugee Convention, and then there's the 1967 Optional Protocol. That's the legal framework around refugees. So how does this relate to Sri Lanka? That's the next part. So, as some of you know, IDPs, internally displaced persons, was a big issue in Sri Lanka, especially during the 30-year conflict. There were IDPs who were basically displaced because of the war from place to place for a number of years. And there were IDPs, even post-war, who were trying to return to their homes. And some of their homes were not there anymore because they were occupied by the military. And then at the same time, there were a huge flux of Muslim IDPs in 1990 who were evicted from the north, and most of them went and settled in Puttlam. So that's a brief background about the internally displaced in Sri Lanka due to the conflict. But while that was there, this also recently we've been talking about IDPs, refugees, and asylum seekers as well. As most of you know, you would have heard about in like 2017, 16, 17, there's a Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, where the Rohingya group in Rakhine State, they were anyway facing systemic discrimination, statelessness, targeted violence from the military as well as other Buddhist groups. And they were, in 2017, this kind of escalated to a point that a large influx, and we're talking about 750,000 asylum seekers basically fled to Bangladesh, and including like 400,000 of them who were children. And there was one of the world's largest refugee camps set up in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So that was a recent, very known instance of refugees. Of course, we've also heard about the Syrian refugees. And so wherever there's a conflict around the world, there are people who are trying to escape from it. So I brought up Rohingyas because in 2018, Sri Lanka also had a few Rohingya refugees come to Sri Lanka looking for protection, looking for refuge, basically. And the UN High Commission for Refugees based in Colombo had put them up in safe houses. So what usually happens is when Sri Lanka gets asylum seekers or refugees, the UN High Commission for Refugees office kind of takes care of them. So there's a process by which this is done. So you apply for asylum, you come in as an asylum seeker, and then you put in an application through the UNHCR, and they assess whether your application is genuine and whether you're eligible for refugee status. So because if you get refugee status, that means that the UNHCR is going to look for a host country for you. So there's a country of origin, the middle country, in this case in Sri Lanka, and there's a third country, which is the country they're going to be eventually settled in, because these asylum seekers and refugees, they're not here to stay in Sri Lanka, and they're looking to actually move out somewhere. So we're sort of like a middle country for a short period of time. But when I say short, it's also a process. The UN High Commission for Refugees, the application process itself takes about 5-6 years. So during this interim time, there are a number of asylum seekers and refugees in Sri Lanka. So if you are granted the refugee status by the UNHCR, then that means you're also entitled to some kind of a monthly allowance that allows you to get food, send your kids to school, things like that. So that's why people, when they come to Sri Lanka as asylum seekers, then they apply to the UNHCR to get their refugee status. So they're eligible for these benefits. And the UNHCR itself tries to find a host country for you to move more permanently. So we had, in 2018, some of these refugees in Sri Lanka as well, and the UNHCR was looking after them. There were some Buddhist groups who knew where the safe houses were, who also tried to attack them. And I remember at the time, they had to move these Rohingya refugees who had already sort of fled so much violence to come to Sri Lanka. They took a risk in boats, And then after coming to Sri Lanka, they were then being attacked by Sri Lankans here. So they had to move these people to safer places to make sure that no harm comes to them. Then our most recent, I would say, experience with refugees and asylum seekers was just following the Easter Sunday, the tragic Easter Sunday attacks last year on the 21st of April. So one of the biggest bombs went off in Negombo, and there was a significant asylum seeker and refugee population living in Negombo at the time. And because these people, they're mostly, the count at the time was something like just over 1,063 asylum seekers and refugees in Sri Lanka, and they were mostly from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And so from Pakistan, there are mostly Ahmadis and Christians. Afghanistan, there were Shia Hazaras. And from Iran, there were also political refugees. So these groups are in particular at risk because, for example, the group from Pakistan, Ahmadis, the government in Pakistan itself passed a law I can't remember if it was 1960s or 70s, basically claiming that the Ahmadi population is non-Muslim. So it also panders to groups that want to harass, intimidate, and attack the Ahmadi population in Pakistan, which is why they have fled the country and they're looking for a safe haven elsewhere. And Sri Lanka has been a generous host to them until they find their host countries. So what happened after Easter Sunday attacks was that because there are people who are from Pakistan, which is a majority Muslim country, from Afghanistan, from Iran, they looked like outsiders. So people in Negombo were scared. They were trying to look for vengeance and trying to make sense of what had happened. So these groups, the Ahmadis, the Shia Hazaras, they came under attack in Negombo. So they were already in rented houses, and because of that, their landlords were basically asked to make sure they leave their houses, get them out on the street, don't keep them in Negombo because they are responsible for or behind the attacks. And so almost overnight, 1,000-odd asylum seekers and refugees were left stranded on the roads. They had to seek refuge in the Negombo police station. There were others who stepped in, like there's an Ahmadi mosque in Sri Lanka. So they took some of the Ahmadis in. Actually, there was the highest number. I think it was 900-odd were Ahmadis. And that was in Pasiala. They went to that mosque in Pasiala. So all of these people had to basically flee this violence. So again, just like the Rohingyas before, they have already fled from so much violence from their own countries and now come to another country as a temporary resort till they move to a third country. And in that middle country, again, because they're seen to be outsiders, they were coming under attack, which is a very unpleasant situation. And we should be quite ashamed of ourselves as Sri Lankans that this happened. So that's basically what happened in after the Easter Sunday attacks. And to date, most of them have gone back to their own places in Negombo till their applications are processed or till the UNHCR finds them third host countries, permanent countries to live in. So they have gone back. Some of them have resumed different livelihoods, and the UNHCR is helping the rest of them out as well. So, that's the situation of the refugees at the moment. There were some of them that the government also sent back. Some of them willingly went back to their own countries as well, because also Sri Lanka is not a party to the 1951 convention. It's a difficult battle. So they're almost here in Sri Lanka as far as the state is allowing them to. So it is also good that, Sri Lanka historically has provided a safe haven to people who are escaping violence. And it's also allowed the UNHCR to be here and process applications to help settle them in other countries. So what's also important to note is that in all of Asia, Sri Lanka is not the only country that's not a state party to this. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, none of these South Asian countries are a party to the convention. I think, except I think if you go towards this side, I think Afghanistan and Iran are, but like the rest of the countries aren't towards the Southeast Asia countries as well. So there is a big call and ask for Sri Lanka and more countries in the region to join the 1951 convention, because this would mean that more people, more countries would have an obligation to provide protection for refugees and asylum seekers when people are in need. And another ask from Sri Lanka is to protect and not return asylum seekers who still haven't got refugee status by the UN High Commission for Refugees, and let the UN High Commission for Refugees process applications and find them third host countries. There's also a call for the Sri Lankan government to have a national policy on asylum seekers, so that we have a clear and consistent way of dealing with people who are fleeing violence. And then at the same time, we should also keep in mind that while we are hosting other people from like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, other places around the world are also hosting Sri Lankans who have fled violence, especially during the war. So there are about 130,000 Sri Lankan refugees and about 14,000 asylum seekers in other countries, and mostly in India, who had fled violence during the 30-year war. So looking to the future, it's also important, this refugees and asylum seekers and the law around it is going to be quite interesting, because there are just so many wars that the identity and the crisis, the refugee crisis, is just going to keep escalating. And at the same time, because of how the world is going, there's also going to be climate refugees that the world is going to have to deal with. So I think seeing what's happening around the world, the law will have to evolve, the states will have to take on more responsibilities to take on people who are fleeing very bad situations, from wars to natural disasters to climate change. And that's I think where I'll leave you with those thoughts, because I think with the climate realities and the kind of discussions we've been having last year, led by youth like Greta, is that climate change is happening. It's real, and the world has to prepare to provide some assistance and provide a safe haven to climate refugees and all kinds of refugees for that matter, which is going to be very topical in the years to come. Thank you very much for listening.